The 2005 Takeover, Origins of Decline. If you want to understand why Manchester United are where they are today, you need to understand what happened in 2005, not the football, not the tactics, not the managerial appointments, or the transfer windows. Before any of that, you need to understand the money, because everything that followed, every structural problem, every missed opportunity, every frustration about how this club operates, it all traces back to a single moment, the leveraged buyout that brought the Glazer family into ownership. This isn't about vilifying individuals. This isn't a rant about greed or American owners or lack of football understanding. This is about understanding how a specific financial structure fundamentally altered what Manchester United could be, how a decision made nearly 20 years ago changed the club's relationship with money, with investment, with ambition, and ultimately with success itself. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about what Manchester United was before 2005 and what changed when the Glazers arrived. Before the takeover, a self-sustaining institution, Manchester United in the early 2000s was, financially speaking, one of the most successful football clubs in the world. They generated enormous revenue through matchday income, commercial deals, and broadcasting rights. The club was profitable, well-run, and critically, completely debt-free. They owned their stadium. They had no significant borrowing. The money they made went back into the football operation, wages, transfers, infrastructure, youth development. This didn't mean the club was perfect. There were shareholders, there were dividends, there were commercial priorities that sometimes sat uncomfortably with pure sporting ambition. But the fundamental model was sound. Manchester United funded itself. The success on the pitch drove the commercial success, which in turn funded more success on the pitch. It was, in the truest sense, a football club that paid its own way. When Malcolm Glazer began accumulating shares in 2003, United were valued at roughly £800 million. By May 2005, the Glazer family had acquired enough shares to take full control. The final purchase price was approximately £790 million. And this is where the story gets important, because of how that acquisition was funded. Understanding the leveraged buyout. A leveraged buyout sounds complicated, but the concept is actually quite simple. Let me explain it in the most straightforward terms possible. Imagine you want to buy a house worth £500,000, but you don't have £500,000. So you go to a bank and you borrow most of that money. You put down, say, £50,000 of your own money and you borrow £450,000. You now own the house, but the house comes with a mortgage. That mortgage is your responsibility. You have to make the monthly payments. You have to pay the interest. The debt is yours. Now imagine a different scenario. You want to buy that same house, but instead of taking on the mortgage yourself, you structure the deal so that the house itself is responsible for the debt. The house has to pay its own mortgage, not you. You put in a small amount of your own money to make the deal happen, but the house, through whatever income it generates, has to service the debt used to purchase it. That's essentially what a leveraged buyout is. You use borrowed money to acquire an asset, and then you place the debt onto the asset itself. The asset pays for its own acquisition. This is exactly what happened with Manchester United. The Glazer family did not pay £790 million out of their own pocket. They borrowed the vast majority of that money from banks and financial institutions. Estimates suggest they put in around £270 million of their own capital, with the rest, over £500 million, coming from loans. Those loans were then secured against Manchester United itself. The club that had been debt-free for decades suddenly carried over £500 million in debt. Not debt the Glazers owed, debt the club owed. Let me be very clear about what this means. Manchester United, the institution, the football club, was now responsible for paying back the money that was borrowed to buy Manchester United. The owners acquired the club largely using the club's own future earnings as collateral. The immediate financial consequences. The impact was immediate and severe. Suddenly, a club that had no debt was servicing massive loans. Those loans came with interest payments, significant interest payments. In the years immediately following the takeover, United were paying tens of millions of pounds every year just in interest, not paying down the principal debt, just interest. Money that left the club, went to banks and lenders, and provided no footballing benefit whatsoever. To put that in context, in the decade following the takeover, Manchester United paid over £700 million in interest and debt repayments. £700 million. That's money that, in a previous era, would have been reinvested in the squad, in facilities, in the stadium, in youth development. Instead, it serviced the debt used to acquire the club. Now, the club was still generating enormous revenue. United's commercial operation was strong and getting stronger. Broadcasting money was increasing. But here's the crucial point, that revenue growth wasn't translating into proportional investment because a significant chunk of it was disappearing into debt servicing. This fundamentally changed the club's financial priorities. Previously, the primary concern was, how do we stay competitive on the pitch? After 2005, an equally important concern became, how do we service this debt? Financial stability, in the new structure, wasn't about ensuring the club could invest in success. It was about ensuring the club could meet its obligations to lenders. Long-term, structural changes. The leveraged buyout didn't just create a debt problem, it created a structural problem. Let me explain the difference. When owners invest their own capital into a football club, they're taking on risk. If the club succeeds, their asset appreciates. If it fails, they lose money. That creates a direct incentive alignment. The owner's financial interest is tied to the club's sporting success. They want the team to win because winning increases the value of what they own. But when a club is heavily leveraged, the incentive structure changes. The priority becomes maintaining revenue streams to service debt. Sporting success is desirable, obviously, but financial stability becomes paramount. You can't risk the kind of bold, expensive rebuild that might be necessary for long-term sporting success if it threatens your ability to meet debt payments in the short term. This explains a lot about how Manchester United operated in the years after the takeover. The club spent money, certainly. They remained competitive in the transfer market. But there was a consistent pattern of risk aversion, of prioritising commercial value over sporting investment, of deferring necessary infrastructure spending. Old Trafford, for example, one of the most iconic stadiums in world football, but also a stadium that has seen minimal significant investment since the Glazers arrived. The facilities, by modern standards, are outdated. Parts of the stadium are literally leaking. The training ground, Carrington, while functional, lags behind the state-of-the-art facilities being built by rival clubs. These aren't small oversights. These are major capital projects that require significant upfront investment with no immediate financial return. And that's the problem with a leveraged ownership model. That kind of investment doesn't make sense when your priority is servicing debt and maintaining dividends. Why spend £500 million rebuilding a stadium when the current stadium still generates revenue? Why invest in training facilities when the team is still competitive? The answer, of course, is long-term competitiveness. You invest in infrastructure because it pays dividends over decades. You invest in facilities because they attract better players and develop better youth prospects. You invest because your competitors are investing, and standing still means falling behind. But when you're carrying massive debt, you can't think in those terms. You think in quarters and fiscal years. You think about maintaining the revenue that keeps the whole structure viable. Why early success masked the impact. For several years after the takeover, none of this seemed to matter. Manchester United continued to dominate English football. They won the Premier League in 2007, 2008, and 2009. They reached 3 Champions League finals in 4 years, winning in 2008. The team was still brilliant, still competing at the highest level. This led many people to dismiss concerns about the ownership structure. If United were still winning, what was the problem? The debt, it seemed, was manageable. The club was coping. But this missed the crucial point. United were succeeding despite the ownership structure, not because of it. And more importantly, they were succeeding because of momentum built before the takeover. Sir Alex Ferguson was still in charge. The squad he'd built in the early 2000s was in its prime. Ronaldo, Rooney, Tevez, Vidic, Ferdinand, Evra. These were world-class players either already at the club or signed shortly after the takeover using funds from operations that predated the debt burden. The infrastructure, the scouting network, the youth academy, all of it was functioning based on systems established before 2005. The takeover didn't destroy Manchester United overnight. But it did something more insidious. It slowly, steadily reduced the club's capacity to invest in its own future. And for a while, because of Ferguson's brilliance and the quality of players already in place, nobody noticed. But here's what was happening beneath the surface. Competitors were investing. Chelsea, funded by Roman Abramovich, were spending without constraint. Manchester City, taken over by Abu Dhabi in 2008, were building a sporting project backed by essentially limitless resources. Even clubs like Tottenham and Arsenal were investing heavily in infrastructure, building new stadiums, modernising their operations. Meanwhile, Manchester United were paying interest on debt and dividends to owners who hadn't injected significant personal capital into the club's development. The competitive advantage United had built over decades was being eroded not by poor decisions on the pitch, but by financial structure off it. The foundation of everything that followed. When Ferguson retired in 2013, the true cost of the leveraged buyout became apparent. Suddenly, the club needed to rebuild. They needed to replace a legendary manager. They needed to refresh an aging squad. They needed to modernise infrastructure. They needed to catch up to rivals who had been investing while United had been servicing debt. And they tried. United spent enormous sums on transfers. They hired and fired managers. They attempted rebuilds and restructures, but every attempt was hampered by the fundamental reality that the club was operating under different financial constraints than its direct competitors. City and Chelsea could absorb failed signings. They could write off £50 million on a player who didn't work out and immediately spend another £50 million on a replacement. United, despite generating more revenue, couldn't operate with that freedom because so much of that revenue was spoken for. Debt servicing, dividends to owners, operational costs, all of it constrained what could be invested in the squad. More importantly, the ownership structure created a culture of financial conservatism. Decisions were made by people whose priority wasn't sporting success, but financial sustainability. Footballing expertise was subordinated to business expertise. The club was run more like a commercial franchise than a football institution because that's what the leveraged buyout had turned it into. Understanding what was lost. Here's what people often miss when discussing the Glazer ownership. It's not that they're uniquely malicious or incompetent. It's that the structure they created makes it nearly impossible for the club to operate with the kind of sporting ambition and investment that modern elite football requires. The approximately £1.5 billion that has left Manchester United in debt servicing, interest payments and dividends since 2005, that money didn't go to the Glazers' personal wealth alone. Much of it went to banks, to lenders, to financial institutions. But none of it went into the football club. None of it built a new stadium or training ground. None of it funded a world-class recruitment operation or cutting-edge sports science department. Compare that to what Manchester City has received from their ownership. Direct capital investment, state-of-the-art facilities, a coherent long-term sporting strategy backed by unlimited resources. Or Liverpool under FSG, who cleared the club's debts and invested directly in infrastructure, including a new training ground and stadium expansion. This is the crucial distinction. Manchester United has been self-funding its operation while also funding the debt used to acquire it. Other elite clubs have been receiving investment from owners who want their asset to appreciate through sporting success. Closing reflection. The 2005 leveraged buyout was, in purely financial terms, brilliantly executed. The Glazers acquired one of the world's most valuable football clubs with relatively little of their own money, placed the debt onto the club itself, and have extracted significant wealth through dividends while the club's value has appreciated enormously. But from a sporting perspective, from the perspective of what Manchester United needed to remain an elite football institution, it was catastrophic. It transformed a debt-free, self-sustaining club into a highly leveraged business. It replaced investment ambition with financial obligation. It created a structure where the club's vast revenues were as much about servicing debt as funding success. Everything that came after, every managerial failure, every transfer window frustration, every infrastructure complaint, every moment of dysfunction, all of it has occurred within the context created by that single decision in 2005. Not because it doomed the club to failure, but because it made sustained success exponentially harder to achieve. This is the foundation. This is where it started. And until you understand this, until you understand how the leveraged buyout fundamentally altered what Manchester United could be, you can't fully understand why the club has struggled for the past decade and why those struggles will likely continue until the underlying financial structure is resolved. This isn't about abstract economics. It's about accountability. The Glazers imposed a financial model on Manchester United that no club should have to bear. The leveraged buyout in 2005 wasn't some inevitable market force. It was a deliberate choice by owners who saddled a debt-free, profitable club with hundreds of millions in debt to fund their own acquisition. Every constraint Manchester United has faced since, every missed transfer target, every delayed stadium upgrade, every dividend payment while the infrastructure crumbled, traces directly back to that decision. The Glazers created this reality, and they alone are responsible for the decline of one of football's greatest institutions.